How could 60 men survive for weeks on a narrow wooden ship in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic without a single toilet? Picture the scene for a moment. A Viking longship cuts through dark, restless seas beneath a sky heavy with wind and salt. The hull groans as waves crash against the planks, and icy spray lashes across the deck, soaking the crew's thick wool cloaks. Yet the men move with practiced balance, stepping between the rowing benches as if the rolling ocean were solid ground. These benches are not only where they row, they are where they sleep. Here they eat their shared provisions of dried fish, salted meat, and hard bread. Day and night, dozens of men live shoulder to shoulder in a space barely wider than a modern city bus, breathing the same cold air while the ship pushes deeper into the Atlantic. And yet something essential is missing. There is no bathroom, no chamber pot, no sanitation system of any kind. By every rule of biology, this floating world should become a breeding ground for disease within days. Human waste breeds bacteria. Spoiled water turns deadly. In cramped conditions like these, infection normally spreads faster than the wind itself. History proves it. Centuries later, sailors on much larger ships, with doctors, medical rules, and organized sanitation, still died in terrifying numbers from cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. And yet the Vikings sailed. They crossed some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, again and again. They colonized Iceland in 874, settled Greenland in 985, and around the year, 1,000 Norse sailors stepped onto the shores of North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So the question remains, how did these men survive weeks at sea without sickness tearing through their ships? The answer lies in a system so simple that most people overlook it entirely. And strangely enough, the first clue begins with something archaeologists expected to find, but never did. When some of the greatest Viking ships were excavated in Norway, archaeologists expected to uncover the practical details of life at sea, including some kind of sanitation system. Ships that carried dozens of men across the North Atlantic must have had a solution for something as basic as human waste. At least, that was the assumption. The discoveries themselves were extraordinary. The famous ships of Oseberg ship and Gokstad ship, along with later finds scattered across Scandinavia, preserved an astonishing snapshot of Viking life more than 1,000 years ago. Inside these vessels, researchers found carved wooden decorations, cooking equipment, storage chests, ropes, tools, and even delicate fragments of textiles that had survived centuries underground. Every discovery added another piece to the puzzle of how Viking crews lived and traveled. But one thing was strangely absent. There were no toilets, no waste containers, no chamber pots, not even a clearly designated sanitation area anywhere on the ships. For years, this absence puzzled historians. How could a seafaring culture capable of crossing the Atlantic overlook something so basic? These were not primitive rafts drifting along the coast. Viking longships were sophisticated machines of exploration and warfare vessels that carried crews thousands of miles across open ocean. Eventually, archaeologists began to realize something remarkable. The Vikings had not forgotten sanitation. They had intentionally designed their ships so they would never need it. Viking longships were built for speed, flexibility, and efficiency. Most measured around 30 meters in length, but only about 3 meters in width. This long, narrow hull allowed the vessel to slice through waves with minimal resistance and travel not only across open seas, but also far up shallow rivers. Every plank, every beam, and every curve of the hull served a purpose. There was no lower deck and almost no unused space anywhere on the ship. The entire vessel was essentially a single open platform built for rowing, sailing, and rapid movement. Even small changes in weight could affect speed and maneuverability. In such a design, a permanent toilet would have been a serious flaw. It would take up valuable space, it would add unnecessary weight, and worst of all, it would create a place where waste could collect and rot during long voyages. For Viking shipbuilders, the solution was simple and surprisingly elegant. Instead of storing waste on the ship, they eliminated the need to store it at all. The Longship itself was designed so that anything unwanted could disappear immediately, leaving no trace behind. One of the most distinctive features of a Viking longship was its remarkably low sides. Stand on the deck, and the ocean felt almost within arm's reach. Unlike later sailing vessels with towering hulls and enclosed decks, the Viking longship was open to the sea. The crew worked only a few feet above the waterline, surrounded by wind, waves, and the endless horizon. This design had an obvious advantage in battle. Warriors could leap over the side in seconds during coastal raids, or pull the ship quickly onto a beach. But the same feature also solved a quieter, less glamorous problem: sanitation. Anything unwanted simply went overboard. Human waste, food scraps, dirty water, from cooking or cleaning. All of it disappeared instantly into the open sea. In the vast waters of the North Atlantic, this mattered more than it might seem. Powerful ocean currents, constant wave motion, and high salt concentrations created an environment where waste could not easily accumulate. Bacteria that might thrive in stagnant conditions were quickly diluted and dispersed. Instead of building up in a confined space like the lower decks of later ships, waste was carried away almost immediately into an environment far too large for pathogens to concentrate. For the crew, the process was simple. In calm weather, a sailor could lean over the side of the ship and let gravity and the ocean do the rest. There were no pipes, no containers, and no storage areas where waste could sit and rot. The sea handled everything. During rough weather, when towering waves made leaning over the edge dangerous, the crew relied on wooden household buckets. These were common tools in Viking daily life, used on farms and in villages for carrying water or grain. On a ship, they served as temporary containers, used briefly and then emptied overboard as soon as conditions allowed. The rule was clear and absolute. Nothing stayed on the ship longer than necessary. Nothing was stored. Nothing was allowed to decay inside the vessel. This simple habit prevented the slow buildup of organic waste that plagued many later ships. By refusing to keep anything on board that could rot, Viking crews removed one of the most common sources of disease in confined maritime environments. In effect, the Longship had no internal sanitation system at all because it didn't need one. The entire North Atlantic served as its disposal system. The ocean itself became the crew's waste management network, endlessly moving, endlessly diluting, and endlessly carrying unwanted material away. But this solution worked only because Viking ships possessed another hidden advantage, one that many later ocean vessels did not. They were never truly far from land. Most medieval ships depended on deep harbors. Their heavy hulls and deep keels required protected ports where sailors could safely dock, unload supplies, and repair the vessel. For much of maritime history, this limitation shaped where ships could travel and how long their crews were forced to remain at sea. Viking longships were built differently. Their shallow draft meant that the hull often sat barely a meter beneath the surface of the water. This gave the ship an extraordinary level of mobility. Instead of relying on large ports, a longship could glide easily through shallow coastal waters, slip into narrow river mouths, and travel far inland along winding waterways. The same design allowed the vessel to approach land in places where most ships would run aground. When a crew needed to stop, the process was simple and remarkably fast. The rowers drove the ship toward shore with powerful strokes, building momentum as the long hull sliced through the water. Then the bow slid directly onto the sand or gravel of a beach. The keel settled gently into the shoreline, and within seconds, the crew could step off the vessel into shallow water. Suddenly, the ship was no longer their entire world. The men spread out across the landscape, stretching legs stiff from rowing benches and the constant motion of the sea. Here, on solid ground, many of the pressures of life on board disappeared instantly. They could relieve themselves on land, where soil and natural bacteria absorbed waste safely and efficiently. They could wash their clothing in nearby streams and scrub their bodies with cold water, sand, and handfuls of grass. Salt and sweat that had accumulated during long hours at sea could finally be rinsed away. Food preparation also became easier and safer. Cooking fires that would have been dangerous on a wooden ship surrounded by tarred planks could now burn openly on the beach. Pots could be set over the flames, and fresh fish or gathered food could be prepared without risking the vessel. Archaeological research across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic has revealed that this pattern was not occasional, it was routine. Throughout the Viking world, researchers have identified hundreds of natural landing points used by longships. Protected beaches, quiet river mouths, small, sheltered coves hidden along rugged coastlines. Each of these locations served as a temporary harbor where crews could pause, recover, and restore basic hygiene. In many ways, they functioned like biological reset points, allowing the crew to break the cycle of confinement that life at sea normally created. Because of this mobility, the ship rarely became a sealed living environment. It was never meant to be a permanent floating home. Instead, the Longship remained what it was designed to be, a fast and flexible vehicle, one that carried its crew from one safe landing place to the next, where both men and ship could recover before the journey continued. There is another detail about the Vikings that often surprises modern audiences. Despite their fierce reputation as raiders and warriors, Norse society placed an unusually strong emphasis on personal hygiene. The image many people imagine wild, filthy barbarians from the north simply does not match what archaeologists have discovered. Again and again, excavations across Scandinavia reveal the same small but telling objects inside Viking graves. Carefully crafted grooming tools appear beside weapons, jewelry, and everyday possessions. Among the most common are finely carved combs made from bone or antler, along with delicate tweezers and slender ear cleaning tools. These items were not rare luxuries reserved for the wealthy. They appear so frequently that historians believe most Viking adults carried a personal grooming kit as part of their daily belongings. Combing one's hair was not considered vanity. It was routine. Hair and beards were expected to be maintained carefully, both for comfort and for appearance. Tangled hair could harbor dirt and parasites, so regular grooming was practical as much as it was cultural. Clothing was also cleaned whenever the opportunity appeared, especially during stops on land where water and open space made washing easier. Even foreign observers noticed this habit and sometimes complained about it. Several medieval English chroniclers wrote with clear irritation that Viking settlers living in England bathed regularly, combed their hair, and dressed with surprising care. Their criticism was not really about hygiene itself. The deeper complaint was social. According to these writers, the well-groomed appearance of Viking men made them appealing to local women, something that angered many English husbands and church leaders. In a time when much of medieval Europe bathed only occasionally, sometimes only a few times a year, the Norse approach to cleanliness stood out dramatically. What others considered unusual, Vikings treated as normal behavior. For the crews of longships, this cultural habit mattered more than anyone at the time could have understood. Regular grooming helped remove lice and parasites that often spread disease in crowded medieval environments. Clean clothing and washed bodies reduced the buildup of bacteria during long journeys. In other words, Viking hygiene was not simply a matter of pride or appearance. It was quietly helping to keep entire crews healthier during the long and dangerous voyages that defined their world. This cultural habit of cleanliness reached its peak on one particular day of the week, Saturday. In the language of the Vikings, Saturday carried a very literal meaning. In Old Norse, the day was known as lagardagar, which translates directly to washing day. It was not simply a casual suggestion or occasional habit. It was a routine built deeply into Norse life. Once every week, Vikings bathed. For people living in the harsh climate of Scandinavia, this required real effort. During the long northern winters, water had to be heated over fires before anyone could wash. Fuel was valuable, and warm water was never taken for granted. Yet the ritual continued because it had become a cultural expectation. During voyages at sea, the process was simpler, but no less important. Whenever a longship landed along a shoreline, crew members used cold seawater or nearby streams to scrub away salt, sweat, and dirt collected during days of rowing and sailing. Clothing was rinsed, hair was combed, and bodies were washed as best as the environment allowed. The consistency of this behavior shaped not only daily life, but language itself. A weekly bathing day was so normal in Norse society that it became embedded in the name of the day. Clean bodies and washed clothing were not luxuries. They were expected. Without realizing it, this routine produced an important health advantage. In crowded medieval societies, parasites such as lice spread rapidly from person to person. Ships, military camps, and tightly packed settlements often became ideal environments for infestation. These small insects were more than a nuisance. They carried dangerous bacteria responsible for diseases like epidemic typhus. But the Viking routine disrupted that cycle. Frequent combing removed adult lice before they could reproduce. Regular washing reduced the number of parasites clinging to skin and clothing. Even simple grooming tools made a measurable difference in controlling infestations that might otherwise spread quickly among a crew. The combs, tweezers, and small cleaning tools found in Viking graves were not decorative objects placed beside the dead for symbolic reasons. They were everyday tools of survival, quiet weapons in the constant fight to stay healthy in a harsh and unpredictable world. Another hidden danger aboard historical ships was something every sailor depended on: fresh water. Long before modern sanitation or refrigeration, stored water could become dangerous surprisingly quickly. Inside wooden barrels, water often sat for weeks in dark, stagnant conditions. Bacteria multiplied silently, algae formed along the interior walls, and what began as a life-saving supply could gradually transform into a source of sickness. For sailors in later centuries, contaminated water became one of the most feared threats at sea. In cramped ships crossing long distances, disease spread rapidly through crews weakened by spoiled supplies. Some sailors came to distrust their own drinking water almost as much as enemy cannons or violent storms. The Vikings, however, approached the problem in a different way. Instead of relying heavily on plain water, they often carried weak beer and fermented dairy products as part of their regular provisions. To modernize, this might appear to be a cultural preference, perhaps even a simple matter of taste, but it carried an important and unexpected advantage. Brewing beer required boiling water during the preparation process. Long before anyone understood bacteria or microbiology, this step had a powerful effect. Boiling killed many harmful microorganisms that might otherwise survive in untreated water. Once the beer was fermented and stored, it remained far more stable than ordinary water sitting in a barrel. Fermented dairy products worked through a similar principle. As milk fermented, beneficial bacteria produced natural acids that slowed or prevented the growth of dangerous pathogens. The result was a drink that could remain safer for longer periods, even during travel. Without realizing it, Viking sailors were regularly consuming liquids that were far less likely to spread disease than untreated water alone. What seemed like an ordinary part of daily life, beer with meals or fermented milk during a journey, quietly became a powerful line of defense against one of the most common causes of illness in maritime history. There was another unusual feature of Viking ships, one that might seem like a flaw at first glance. Viking longships were never completely watertight. These vessels were built using a method known as clinker construction, where overlapping wooden planks formed the outer hull. The seams between those planks were sealed with tar and natural fibers, creating a flexible structure strong enough to survive heavy seas. But despite this careful craftsmanship, a small amount of seawater almost always seeped slowly through the hull. To modernize, that might sound like poor engineering. A leaking ship seems like a dangerous design. Yet in reality, this constant seepage created an unexpected advantage. At the very bottom of any ship lies a space known as the bilge, the lowest part of the hull where water naturally collects. On many later sailing vessels with tightly sealed hulls, this area often became stagnant. Spilled food, animal waste, and organic debris would settle there and slowly rot. Over time, the bilge could turn into a foul, toxic environment filled with bacteria and dangerous gases, sometimes making sailors sick simply from the air below deck. Viking ships functioned differently. Because small amounts of seawater continually seeped inside, the bilge never stayed dry for long. Crew members regularly bailed out the water that gathered there, using simple wooden buckets. Each time they removed the water, they also removed anything that had collected in it: spilled food, dirt, or other organic waste that might otherwise begin to decay. In effect, the ship was constantly being rinsed. Instead of allowing waste to sit and rot in hidden spaces, The combination of seawater and regular bailing created a natural flushing system. The ocean itself flowed quietly through the vessel, carrying away debris before it had time to become a problem. What looked like a minor imperfection in the ship's construction actually became a subtle form of sanitation, one more way Viking longships kept their crews healthier during long and dangerous voyages. No single invention explains how Viking crews survived the brutal reality of long voyages across the North Atlantic. There was no complex sanitation device, no hidden mechanism built into the ship. Instead, the real secret was the quiet combination of several simple strategies working together. The design of the Longship itself prevented waste from accumulating in the first place. Its open deck and low sides allowed anything unwanted to be thrown directly into the sea. The ocean then did the rest, dispersing waste instantly into an environment far too vast for bacteria to concentrate. When crews reached land, the ship's shallow draft allowed them to beach almost anywhere, giving the men space to wash, clean their clothing, and restore basic hygiene. At the same time, Norse cultural habits reinforced daily grooming and cleanliness, while fermented drinks provided a safer alternative to stored water. Even the ship's slightly leaking hull played a role, as constant bailing flushed away debris before it could rot. Each layer quietly supported the others. If storms kept the crew from landing, waste could still be discarded overboard. If hygiene slipped during long stretches at sea, the next stop on land reset the system. No officer enforced these rules. They worked because they were woven naturally into the design of the ship, the culture of the crew, and the travel patterns of the Vikings themselves. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers stood on distant shores across the Atlantic, places no Europeans had ever seen before. They arrived alive, strong enough to explore, and ready to continue the journey. Their survival was not a miracle. It was the result of practical knowledge built slowly across generations of sailors who learned how to live with the ocean rather than fight it. The Vikings never eliminated disease completely, but they understood something surprisingly powerful. Instead of trying to control every threat directly, they designed their lives so those threats rarely had the chance to grow. Waste never accumulated. Ships never became sealed, environments filled with rot. Crews stayed mobile, moving constantly between sea and land. The system worked not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. And sometimes the most powerful solutions in history are the ones so natural that they become almost invisible. Here on Primal Heritage, we explore these forgotten survival strategies hidden inside ancient cultures. Long before modern technology, people learned how to work with nature in ways that kept them alive against incredible odds. So, the next time you imagine a Viking longship crossing the Atlantic, remember that the greatest engineering on that vessel was not only the sail or the hull. It was the quiet system that kept 60 men healthy in a place where survival should have been impossible.